Welcome to this latest edition of our Buckinghamshire Trustee Network webcasts. I'm delighted today to be able to introduce you to three of our speakers. So first up, we have Charlie McMahon, who's a client manager at Richardsons Chartered Accountants. And Charlie's going to be talking to us about fraud within the charity sector and the steps we can take to prevent that. Next up, we'll have Connell, who's a managing partner at Evelyn Partners, and she'll be talking about how to protect the value of grants in cash and looking at cautious bond portfolios. And finally, we'll welcome Emma Hurrell, who's a partner at BP Collins law firm, and she'll be looking at the trusts governing documents and how they influence daily decision making and how frequently they should be reviewed or updated. So it's a really packed agenda today with lots of interesting and very relevant subject matter. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Charlie. Welcome, Charlie, and thank you for joining us today.
No problem, thank you. Good morning, everyone. Just a sort of quick introduction from me. As mentioned, I'm one of the client managers here at Richardsons. I've been here for almost 10 years now, and I kind of look over a range of our charity clients, so including charitable trusts, charitable companies, CIOs as well. And they range in sectors from social housing to sort of mental, physical healthcare, and all the way up to rehabilitation for those sort of struggling to get back into work. So I suppose I'll start off by saying, as we all know on this sort of briefing today, charities, I suppose, are built on trust. As we all know, they rely on the sort of goodwill of donors, dedicated volunteers, and the commitment of staff and trustees alike to sort of come together to make a positive impact. But a growing problem we're kind of noticing at the moment, especially within the charitable sector, is fraud. Now, when I say fraud, not everyone knows exactly what we mean. So the definition of fraud is some form of dishonesty when making a false representation, maybe failing to disclose information, or abuse of power, with the intent to gain personally or for the organisation, or cause some form of loss as well. Now, BDO actually produce a very handy sort of annual fraud report, and I've got some kind of key but interesting and slightly alarming sort of facts and figures to share with you from the most recent 2024 one. So of those who reported back in their survey, 42% of people had reported some form of actual or attempted fraud, 35% of which thought they had experienced more fraud than the year before. So it kind of shows that it's a growing problem and not something that's going to go away anytime soon. 50% of those frauds detected were perpetrated by an insider. So again, that kind of shows us that we're not just looking for these external fraudsters. You know, it can happen from within. And 84% of the frauds resulted in some form of financial loss. So again, something to be quite concerned about. Now, a recent real life case to share with you, or to kind of show that there is something that is happening around the world. A former charity boss was recently sent to prison for embezzling almost £100,000 from two charities, including £85,000 from one of their best friends' charities. So again, it shows kind of you can't just take people's word for it. You can't just rely too much on people that you know. And they used forged signatures to reroute funds to personal accounts. You know, this is clearly a sort of misuse of position, as we spoke about. And like I said, led to a prison sentence and a repayment order for the funds. And we have to be careful now, especially with the cost of living crisis, that the issue is not exacerbated. You know, more and more people are in need of funds, so it's something that needs to be at the forefront of everyone's minds. Some common types of fraud then. So as I mentioned, we have embezzlement, which is trustees, employees, volunteers diverting funds for personal use. And like I said, that can be done by unauthorized payments, falsifying invoices. Those are the most common tactics that we see. False reporting or misrepresentation, so inflating expenses or underreporting income to conceal a sort of misuse of funds, and maybe falsifying donor contributions to appear more credible, to appear more trustworthy, and to maybe qualify for particular grants. Self-dealing by trustees. So this is trustees using the assets of the charity for their own benefit. And an example of this may be awarding contracts to companies that they perhaps own or have an interest in. Obviously, there's a conflict of interest issue there. Grant fraud, so misrepresenting how grant funds are used. This can be done by creating fake programs or outcomes to sort of, retain that future funding to keep the charity going. And donor fraud, falsifying donation receipts to help donors claim larger tax deductions and or soliciting donations for programs, again, that don't exist. One of the common things we're seeing a lot at the moment is fraud with regards to banking. So ways that this can be done, for example, is expenses fraud. So perhaps trustees or staff claiming fraudulent expenses that they haven't incurred, that aren't real, and getting them processed through the bank. There's something called authorized push payment scams, or APP scams, you may have seen in the news headlines and in articles. And this is basically fraudsters tricking not just charities, but many organizations into making payments to fraudulent accounts. And they often do this by setting up what seems very, very real looking websites, impersonating, big reputable companies and or banks. They basically make you put details in, and all of a sudden you think you're paying a legitimate sort of transaction, but in actual fact, you're just paying the fraudsters. And they're getting smarter and harder to detect. Like I said, creating lookalike websites. So just be extra cautious if there's anything that crops up that doesn't quite look right. Following on from things that don't look right, some sort of red flags you can be looking for. Split these out into internal and external. So internally, you could be looking for anyone perhaps unwilling to share their duties or give an insight into processes as to how things work, perhaps replacing a long-standing existing supplier with a new personal connection just out of the blue with any sort of tendering or notes about that. Refusal to implement any anti-fraud policies and procedures. Obviously, that's a massive alarm bell that should be ringing. And incomplete or inaccessible financial records, or if they are accessible, is there explainable variances? Is there any form of financial transparency? If not, then this is something that should be, again, ringing alarm bells within the organization. Externally, you can look for vague and evasive information. Has the person communicating with you been specific about their aim, their activities, how funds are used? Missing registrations, is there a legitimate registration number anywhere on the communication? Is there a way to cross-check this to any sort of, the Charities Commission, any other regulatory bodies? Are they asking for unusual payment methods? So in this instance, think about foreign currencies, think about cryptocurrencies, think about any unfamiliar online payment apps that you haven't used before. Chances are, if you've not heard of it, there's probably a good reason why you haven't heard of it. And high pressure tactics and sensitive information, charities often, if they're legitimate, understand the sort of implications of another charity giving up their funds, and so they won't pressure you into making an immediate decision. Likewise, they won't often request personal information. So if they have done that, then again, just think twice before you follow through with the request. Some sort of legal and ethical consequences of fraud then. So trustees, volunteers, employees, anyone involved in fraud can face civil lawsuits and or criminal prosecution, as I mentioned previously. Tax consequences, the charity may lose its tax-exempt status if found to be dealing in fraudulent transactions. And then financial loss, like I said, it may be significant to the point where the charity can no longer carry on. And probably another really, really big point is non-financial loss, which people often don't think about. And one of the biggest things we see there is reputation. I mean, as we all know, public trust is very hard to rebuild once it's been broken. So some barriers that you may encounter to fraud prevention. Again, we see these quite often, so I just thought I'd make you aware of them. So lack of internal resource, that's quite a big one. Often people saying there's insufficient staffing or volunteer availability at the required level. Over-reliance on trust, as I mentioned earlier, with the real-life case, particularly on long-standing employees, volunteers. There can be issues absolutely anywhere, so it's just making sure that you're always skeptical. Lack of fraud awareness. Some people simply just do not know what they're looking for or what to do if they've found something that's not supposed to be there. And reluctance to accept fraud as a risk, having the attitude that it hasn't happened to us yet, it probably won't ever happen, so I'm not going to do anything about it. It can happen to absolutely anyone, so it's always best to have the procedures in place to kind of prevent that. And following on, so some sort of fraud prevention and oversight. So strong governance, regular trustee meetings, making sure minutes are documented, having clear conflict of interest policies, perhaps with disclosure agreements having to be signed. We see that often for our clients here. Financial controls, so dual signatories on the bank. And if you're finding that you can't implement it for every single transaction, maybe consider a payment limit over which there must be dual authorization. Having external and internal audits. And if you're not required to get an external audit, perhaps by being over the financial limits, then maybe implement a policy that requires one every few years, just to kind of keep things rolling over. Whistleblowing policies, so encourage staff and volunteers to report any suspicious behaviour without the fear of any sort of retaliation or conflict. Internal training, this is the big one we see. So providing sort of baseline training for all staff, volunteers, trustees alike on what to look for, how to deal with things, and basically encouraging a positive sort of workplace environment around fraud prevention. Fidelity or cyber insurance, in the event that something ever did go wrong, despite doing everything you can in your power to make sure you've taken all precautions, having some form of insurance can almost help the charity keep operating in the event of financial losses. Having a central sort of risk register and fraud policies that can be accessed by everyone. It's important to make sure that they are easily accessible. So if anyone did ever need to look them up, it doesn't take, rummaging through countless files or documents to find what should be a quite straightforward standard procedure. And some IT and cyber responses you can implement. So regular password changes, not having passwords written down on, say, a post-it note, for example, and keep the passwords complex, use letters, numbers, special characters, that kind of thing. Another big one we're seeing recently, especially here where I work, is two-factor authentication. So this basically, you log into a website, it will then send a code or it will send something to an app, which you have to verify has been you that's making the sign in. We have it on almost every app. And even though it may seem tedious and some people may be reluctant to sort of implement the change, it does work wonders, because if something ever does go wrong in the initial stage, you always have that sort of backup of the two-factor authentication to stop people getting into places where they shouldn't be. New payment details from suppliers. Again, if you see an invoice that has a change in payment details, don't just trust it's real. Like I said earlier, fraudsters can implement tactics to almost intervene before the invoice is sent, change it, and then have it delivered to you. So just call your usual contact at the supplier and verify over the phone that the payment details are as they say they are. And implement firewalls and antivirus software to protect the network and sort of protect the charitable organization as a whole. So yeah, I think that's probably everything from me. Hopefully that's given everyone an insight into what fraud is, recent cases, the implications, and prevention sort of methods and things you can use within the workplace. But yeah, if there's any questions, then yeah, I'm sure my details will be passed around. So feel free to email or pick up the phone, and I'll be happy to help. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Charlie. That was an excellent run through of why I think fraud and fraud prevention should be front and center in the mind of all trustees, and why we need these sort of robust financial controls, particularly as charities. I mean, it's very sad when fraudsters do target charities, and we always see these sort of incidents of small charities being targeted. So a very sad state of affairs that people are targeting charitable funds for criminal intent. But yeah, really good reminder of some of the tips and some of the things that we can all do to prevent that. So thank you very much. Next up, I'd like to welcome Caroline Connell from Evelyn Partners, who's going to talk to us about the maintaining the value of portfolio investments cautiously through cash and bonds. So, Caroline, welcome. And thank you very much for being with us today.
Thank you very much. So Henry's introduced it that we're going to be talking about how we can protect the value of grants and cash and cautious bond portfolios. So I'm one of the managing partners here at Evelyn Partners. I sit in the London charity team. And what we have found with our charities that a lot of our charities are holding cash. And I thought it'd be really pertinent and important today to share some of the opportunities that you can to enhance return and provide a better level of protection. So when we think about cash, there is risk to holding cash. People often feel that it's something that's very cautious and protected, but it's worth remembering that there is a default risk with commercial bank paper. So if you're holding your deposits in the bank, there is a risk of default. Clearly, when there's heightened volatility, this risk increases. And I think people will remember back in 2008, 2009, when there were defaults. And that's when the Financial Services Compensation Scheme had to step in, and that provides protection up to 85,000. So anything held over 85,000, you are at risk of losing your cash. So from our perspective, it's really important to think of different options of how you may be able to protect your capital that you're holding in cash, and look for alternatives of what you might be able to do. So for the purpose of today, I thought I would roll through some of the options that we can look at. So here we provide, in cases, cash and cautious bond portfolios that you can see there on the left-hand side in purple. And what I'm just going to cover today is some of the options that you might consider to hold instead of cash. So on the right-hand side, you can see there are money market funds, UK Treasury bills, so T-bills, or UK government bonds, also more familiarly known as gilts. And the one that's probably less familiar is supranational, sub-sovereign and agency bonds, also known as SSAs. Example of that is the World Bank lending arm, which is the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development. So all of these provide us different options that we might use with our charities. So in cases, charities may be protecting grants that they are making, or they may have been in receipt of grants, or they may have received legacies, or they may have longer term liabilities. So the purpose of these different assets provide us different levels of maturity and different levels of return. So if we start with the shorter term, or what we've perceived as liquidity, so this might be where the charity has short-term requirement for this cash, and if they hold it within their bank, they are likely to be receiving quite low levels of interest. Clearly, we've moved from what was perceived as a really ultra-low interest rate environment up until 2022, where cash was not providing you much return, but actually since then, with the rise of inflation and rise of interest rates, cash really should be working harder for us. So with the kind of different options, we can provide an enhanced return and for a very safe, secure solution. So if we look at UK government T-bills, Treasury bills, these are short-term debt issued by UK government, backed by UK Treasury, and they will be issued with 1, 3 or 6 month maturities. So for example, if you have cash and you're looking to use the funds in perhaps 1 month, 3 months or 6 months, you might want to use the option to use a T-bill. Again, you are getting good rates of return, in most cases higher than what you might be receiving in cash bank accounts, but with enhanced protection. Like I say, UK T-bills provide that maturity schedule, but there is also a secondary market. So you're not constrained to just buying something with a 1, 3 or 6 month maturity, but they are issued at a discount and mature at £100. So all of the return will be growth, and you will not receive kind of an income payment that you may be more used to receiving. The return is through growth. As I said, there is a secondary market. That means you can buy T-bills at different times, so with different maturities. So you might buy something that's already been running for a month, so would have a 2 month maturity. Very flexible and provides you that enhanced protection with unlimited protection backed by UK Treasury. So that's on the kind of T-bill side. If, for example, you need an effective kind of cash reserve, and it might be very short-term requirement, something like a money market fund is very flexible. So unlike T-bills and some of the gilts and supranationals, there is no fixed maturity date. So it is a fund, and within the fund, they will be buying very short-dated debt, sometimes overnight, sometimes a few days, but it will be from governments, banks and companies, all with a very high credit rating, which provides a greater or a lesser risk of default risk. So there is some default risk with corporate debt, but like I say, it's very short dated, and it allows you the flexibility to be receiving a higher rate of interest without needing to set a longer term maturity date. So, for example, the kind of liquidity money market funds that we invest into will typically be achieving just below the Bank of England rate of interest. So very flexible and helpful, where there is no longer term requirement or for holding kind of short term emergency cash. Then the longer term bonds, so you see that in the green section, provide longer dated maturities so that you can lock in for a longer period of time. So often when you're holding kind of bank interest or cash with the bank, you will need to lock up for kind of 2, 3 or 5 years, but you do not have the ability to come out of it at an earlier date without losing your interest, where things like the UK gilts and SSAs become very helpful is where you perceive that you might have a longer term requirement, but it gives you the flexibility to trade it earlier or to sell earlier, and not lose all of the interest. So UK gilts have very long time horizons, often used for pension funds to match liabilities, so have a very long date for maturity, but for the purposes of our cash and cautious bonds, which are very low risk portfolios, they will always have a maturity of 5 years or less. But again, gilts are backed by UK Treasury and will typically have maturities, running into kind of decades away, but there will normally be a maturity every few months. Likewise with the SSAs, they will also have maturities over that time. So when we're thinking around how can it help charities, kind of touched on it, is there a short-term requirement? You might not have the data requirement, but we would look to using the money market funds or the T-bills, because they will provide an enhanced return at short period of investment. And then if there is a low level of credit risk that you might have from a bank, again, all of these assets would fall into that, but the gilts can be very helpful. And where we've seen kind of the best use of all of these assets is where a charity might have fixed liabilities over a period of time, and we can create this portfolio that will match those liabilities over time. We are maximising the yield over that period, and it will be the SSAs or the gilts that would have the highest return. But as I've already said, you might buy a gilt for 5 years, but you can sell out of it earlier. It is a very liquid market, whilst the shorter dated bonds will typically move quite linearly to their maturity. Once you've got kind of 2 or 3 years, there can be movement in that return, but you are still able to come out of it at any point. So I think that covers what I wanted to talk about today. Hopefully that's given you a flavour of what you could be doing with your cash that might be sitting at the bank and make it work a little bit harder. And I think it's just important to remember under Charity Commission guidance and CC14, there is a duty to kind of act where you can get a better level of return for a similar level of risk. So I think it's just important to assess how you may be able to kind of enhance returns and make the cash work harder for you over that time. But again, if there's any questions, very happy to help.
Brilliant. Thank you, Carolyn. That's a really good whistle-stop tour of some of the different strategies that trustees can take when looking after their trust's assets. I just thought it was a great moment to consider for trustees to think about considering different investment strategies for their endowment funds, and actually applying a bit of regular scrutiny to that process, and thinking carefully about perhaps if they haven't changed how they do things for a few years, it might be an opportune moment now to consider just having a conversation with somebody about what the best return they can get, and whether their risk, their appetite for risk meets their current strategy. So thank you very much for taking us through that.
Okay.
I'd now like to introduce our final speaker, Emma Hurrell, partner at BP Collins, who's going to talk about how sort of the trusts, your trust governing document can influence your sort of decision-making strategy and approach. So welcome, Emma.
Hello, thanks very much. So I'm a partner in the private client department at BP Collins. We've got offices in Giles Cross, London, Tame, and Ickenham as well. So I cover sort of general estate planning work and trusts, and within that, charitable trusts is something that does crop up. So today, yes, I'm talking about how a trust's governing document influences daily decisions, and how frequently we recommend reviewing or updating the governing document. So this is typically the charitable trust deed, or in the case of other setups, it might be a memorandum and articles of association or a constitution. It just depends on the legal structure that you've got in place. But really, this governing document is the foundation, and it's almost like a toolkit for you as trustees to consult when you're wanting to ensure that you are doing everything that you should be. So what you really should do if you're a trustee of a charitable trust is you should read the governing document and make sure that you understand really what the charity is set up to achieve and what its purposes are. You really want to know, who your charity is there to benefit, and what your charity can and cannot do to carry out its purposes. This is something that you need to be keeping under review. So in terms of the various decisions that you need to be thinking about, you just need to be sure that every action or any expenditure is going to be aligned with the charity's charitable objects, which are outlined in the governing document. Typically, the objects and purposes will be set out at the top of the trust deed. The Charity Commission do have a sort of model charitable trust deed which does set out what a typical governing document looks like. And as trustees, you need to really be making sure that you're regularly referring back to the objects. As I'm sure you're aware, there is this public benefit requirement. So to be a charity, your charity must have only charitable purposes which must be for the public benefit. To operate as a charity, as a charity trustee, when running the charity, you must make sure that you're carrying out your charity's purposes for the public benefit. And this is all outlined in the Charities Act 2011. That's where all of this comes from. And also, as a charity trustee, you must report each year on how you've carried out your charity's purposes for the public benefit, and confirm that in doing so, you've had regard to the Charity Commission's public benefit guidance where relevant. So you need to make sure that you're aware of the public benefit guidance, and that you've taken it into account when you're making a decision. And if you've departed from that guidance, you've got to have a good reason for doing so. Under the charitable trust deed, you've got to make sure that the charity's objects are in line with the requirement under the Charities Act 2011. And I always feel you really need to take the guidance from the Charity Commission, because they are essentially the ones who are overseeing everything. And it's as well to really use the sort of template wording for the charitable objects in your governing document, which is taken from the Charity Commission's website, and they've set out the exact sort of wording that you would need to qualify. So it's, I mean, I feel that the Charity Commission are they're a really useful resource. They do have so much information on there. They have lots of Q&A documents as well, and lots of guidance for trustees that you can sort of dip into to just check that you're doing everything properly. So in your governing document, essentially it sets out what the trustees can and cannot do, things like what they can invest in, delegation of their duties, what powers does the charity have, are the powers wide enough to cover the activities that you're running, how are members and trustees going to be appointed, who has that power to appoint them, what's the procedure. All of that needs to be covered in your governing document. There'll be a minimum and maximum number of trustees. There'll be provisions for the removal of trustees. For instance, if someone, a trustee becomes mentally incapable, then there should be information on what to do in those situations. There will also be information in the governing document which helps you to work out how many people you need at each trustee meeting, how are meetings held, what's the requirement for arranging meetings. Do you need a written resolution when you're providing notice of meetings that's sent to the trustees? All of this sort of stuff is covered in the governing document, and it's really imperative that you are doing exactly what your governing document says. It also provides information on conflict of interest policies as well. So that's something that does crop up from time to time. I mean, obviously every charity is keen to avoid that. But the real risk with any conflict of interest issue, for instance, a trustee that's receiving sort of unauthorized private benefits, that could lead to the disqualification of trustees. There might be other things that you're doing which are not in line with your governing document, so that's why it's as well to be periodically checking that document. For instance, you might have applied for a grant, and it's got to be spent on certain activities, and actually you're perhaps not spending the grant on an activity that matches the charity's purposes. So that's another potential risk. You need to make sure that you've got the statutory registers that are being adequately maintained for members and trustees, and that decisions are being made by the right people. With a lot of this, the main risk really of, particularly in relation to funds, if you're not using the funds in the right way as set out in your governing document, the risk for trustees is they may need to repay the charity from their own pocket. So that's obviously a sort of key risk that I think trustees will be keen to avoid. In terms of how often you should review your governing document, a lot of people say every couple of years, although I always feel that given that you will be doing an annual review anyway, and that's always advisable, then it is sensible to review your governing document as part of that annual review. Also, it's sensible if you've got any significant changes that have taken place, perhaps a change in charity law, or changing the assets, or significant change in the trustees. All of that, it's as well to just consult your governing document and to check that you are sort of up to date with everything and following everything and doing everything as you should be. It's advisable as well. Obviously, I'm a lawyer, so very keen on keeping records, but that is really vital that you are keeping records of any information or evidence that you've used to make your decisions, and you need to basically be showing that you've acted properly, and also you've got to tell the Charity Commission about any changes that you make to your governing document, and you shouldn't start implementing your changes until everything's been approved by the Charity Commission. So it's as well to always keep the Charity Commission on board with everything. You know, it is possible that if you're perhaps not doing things in the way that you should be, there may be some sort of investigation. You know, so that's obviously something that I think everyone is keen to avoid. Obviously, that sort of thing can be quite costly. You might need to get legal advice on that, and also it can be quite time consuming as well, and it can put matters on hold for the charity as well. So it's just really good to be as transparent as possible with the Charity Commission. But the key is, I suppose the key thing to take away from this is to make sure that your governing document is what it does cover what you want it to cover, but also it's always advisable to get advice on this and to check that you've got a proper sort of gold standard document that the Charity Commission would be happy with. As I say, they have got a model trustee on their website, which does provide a lot of guidance in terms of what needs to be included. Yeah, and I think the other key message really is to make sure you are doing really an annual review of your document, or if there are any key changes that have arisen. Yeah, so that's a summary really of things to think about. So I'm happy to always be contacted for any questions that you might have, and I will pass back to Henry.
Lovely. Thank you so much, Emma. That was a great summary of what can be quite a complex issue, and I think a really good reminder for us all as people working in trusts that or volunteering, that it's so important for trustees to consider the governing document as a live document, and it's not a sort of one-off activity that comes at the point of formation of a trust, but it's something that needs to be constantly referred back to and updated. So yeah, a really good reminder of that. Thank you. I'd like to say at this point that we're going to put the contact information for all of our speakers at the end of the webinar. So viewers can contact any of them as desired. So I'd now like to move into a quick panel discussion, if I may, and I'd like to come to Charlie, to you first, if that's possible. So I'd like to ask you what simple, a lot of our trusts, a lot of the members of our network are very small, probably wholly run by volunteers or trustees. So what sort of simple and cost-effective tools and practices can these smaller charitable trusts adopt if they're looking to reduce fraud, the risk of fraud?
It's a good question. I would say that there are often loads of free resources online, often something as simple as a quick YouTube video on the ways to prevent fraud. You know, that can be quite a cheap and effective way to get the message round. Maybe some form of internal review amongst the people that do work there for the organisation. You know, reviewing, having a second review of financials, getting second payment approvals on the bank is often a big one, because you know it does implement that second barrier of protection. And yeah, two-factor authentication, that shouldn't be too much of an issue, because once it's implemented, no matter how many people you have working there, again, like I said, it's just that extra level of protection just in case something was to go wrong. I think those are probably the three that I would say are the most important and probably most appropriate in that situation.
Brilliant. Yeah, I think that second approval on the bank payments is such an important step that is so easy to implement.
Yeah.
So yeah, absolutely. Thank you. So just moving on to Caroline now. I think there's a lot of economic uncertainty in the world. you know, and it's been like that for quite a while. It doesn't look like it's going to change any time in the immediate future. How can trustees of charitable trusts assess whether their current investment policy is fit for purpose in an increasingly uncertain economic environment?
Yeah, well, I think with going back to the duty of care, I mean, trustees have a responsibility to look for professional managers if they don't have the expertise internally. And I'd say most charities do look externally for that kind of management. So I think actually exploring the opportunity of how professional may perceive that investment policy statement, because there are lots of things to consider. And often when we speak to trustees, things that they kind of put within their investment policy statement, that they don't quite align to how they are actually managing the portfolios. So I think go and get professional expertise to look at it and provide some guidance. And it may well be that, you know, things do need to change within a kind of investment portfolio, or like I was talking about earlier, around the cash management, because we have moved from a period of a long time where rates have been very low. And I think people have got very used to not earning much on cash, but we have for the last 3 years or 2.5 years moved forward in time where people can get a really high rate of return. Clearly, uncertainty, volatility, it's making sure what you have, whether it's investment or cash, is aligned to what you're trying to achieve.
And I think you put your point on cash management is really important, particularly for trusts where they might have a grant making cycle that is sort of 3, 6 months, sometimes 12 months, actually accruing quite a lot of cash, and managing that in the best possible way is a particularly relevant point for lots of smaller trusts.
Yeah, and I think the smaller trusts often think that they should just keep it in cash because of those short-term liabilities, but there are options out there that give you protection and a better rate of return. So it's really, you know, time is quite critical to look at that, rates where they are.
Brilliant, thank you, Caroline. And Emma, I'd like to come to you now, please.
Yeah, sure.
We're looking at sort of, you know, when we're looking at updating governing documents or reviewing governing documents, obviously the Charity Commission is the place that you would go if you wanted to make any changes to your governing document. How receptive are they to changes being made to perhaps a governing document that was written 30 years ago but needs a bit of modernising, in your experience?
Yeah, I think typically they are sort of more keen on you doing a sort of fresh new document, really. And they do have a lot of guidance on, you know, on their website. But I do think it's advisable to sort of get some advice at that point. You know, some legal advice on the wording. I think that is really important. But I think there are a number of trustees out there which have been written, you know, many years ago, and really do need to be updated. So yeah, I think in that situation, having a fresh start really is probably the best way forward.
Yeah, absolutely. That's good advice. Some of the trusts that we've engaged with over the years, I think the oldest one is about 500 years old. So
Wow.
I think the sort of the purpose, the charitable objects and so on, definitely need refreshing at that point. Yeah. So, well, I think we'll draw things to a close there. I'd like to say a huge thank you to all of our speakers. Charlie from Richardsons Chartered Accountants, Caroline from Evelyn Partners, and Emma from BP Collins. Your contact details will be made available at the end of the recording for anyone wishing to get in touch directly with you to talk about any of the issues you've raised today. So yeah, that just leaves me to say thank you to you, thank you to everyone for watching, and we look forward to seeing you all again soon.